Hey everyone, good day to the Academy Nation and friends, and welcome to our third post-NAIC webinar, where American Academy of Actuary staffers will review hot topics discussed during the National Association of Insurance Commissioners Fall meeting in Denver, and look ahead to the first meeting of 2025 in Indianapolis as well. My name is Ted Gotch, and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Content and Publications at the Academy. I'm your host at this webinar, where my fellow staffers and I will share their insights from the NAIC conference, as well as discuss pending issues likely to be tackled in the near future. I'm here with my colleagues Amanda Barry-Moylanen, Will Beneke, Rob Fisher, Steve Jackson, and Matthew Williams to break down the goings-on from the Mile High City, and you'll be hearing more from them in a moment. This is a previously recorded event, so there will be no questions taken. If you do have comments or queries, feel free to reach out to us at publicpolicy@actuary.org. The slides from this webinar will be available in the Slides and Resources section. Here's a look at the agenda for this event. In a moment, I'll be joined by Director of Public Policy, Matthew Sondak. Then we'll hear from some of my fellow Academy staffers for the specifics of what happened in Denver from each practice area, as well as in research. Finally, we'll wrap up with a quick preview of what we have to look forward to at the NAIC spring meeting. But right now, I'd like to bring in Matthew, who will share some high-level reflections from the meeting. So to get started, Matthew, what were some of the highlights of Denver, especially when it came to professionalism, the ongoing work in the life and health knowledge statements, and interacting with our volunteers?
Thanks, Ted, and thanks for inviting me to today's webinar. There was a lot of activity and energy in Denver, and the Academy was well represented by both our volunteers and by Academy staff. From a professionalism perspective, we offered regular updates from the Committee on Qualifications, the Actuarial Standards Board, and the ABCD during each actuarial task force. These updates offer regulators, other actuaries in the room, and other interested audience members the chance to hear about some of the priorities and opportunities to engage in the public comment process of actuarial standards of practice and Academy professionalism priorities. It also offers the Academy the chance to remind the regulators of the various professionalism resources that the ASB and ABCD offer them in their roles as regulators and as actuaries. In Denver, Academy President Daryl Knapp provided this COQ update, highlighting the monitoring of educational changes coming from the SOA and the CAS and how the USQS applies. To date, the COQ has received 28 questions related primarily to CE and specific qualification requirements. Daryl also reminded the regulators and the other actuaries in the room of the annual bias requirement. Meanwhile, Kevin Dyke, chairperson of the ASB, reminded regulators of the ASB's newsletter, Box 4, which provides updates on revisions and adoptions related to the ASAPs. He then walked regulators through the most recent adopted revisions, proposals that are open for comment, exposure draft comments that are being reviewed, and other standards that are being worked upon. ABCD member Shauna Ackerman reminded the regulators that the popular webinar, Tales from the Dark Side, will be offered on December 6th. This webinar is led by 3 ABCD members, including Shauna, who present illustrative case studies based on issues that have arisen before the ABCD, discuss what actuaries facing such dilemmas could consider and do, and how professionalism documents such as the Code of Professional Conduct and actuarial standards of practice can help. The professionalism team also held a regulator-only lunch session in Denver. This session offers regulators a confidential space to discuss any questions they may have, as well as talk about their role as a state employee, with rules and regulations that inform their role with the insurance department and their role as an actuarial professional that is bound to the same rules and obligations as all practicing actuaries. Sessions like these reflect the Academy's mission to support and maintain the profession's standards of integrity, competency, and reputation. Following up on the presentations in Chicago, the Academy offered some updates and responded to public comments regarding the appointed actuary knowledge statements that were shared with LATIF and HATIF in August. As you may recall, the Academy was asked by LATIF in late 2023 to draft knowledge statements, outlining the knowledge necessary for life actuaries signing certain statements of actuarial opinion, including the appointed actuary, illustration actuary, and qualified actuary for principle-based reserves. In Chicago, the Academy presented the appointed actuary knowledge statements for both life actuaries and health actuaries. At the HATIF meeting in Denver, the Academy was able to provide verbal responses to the public comments that the task force received on the health appointed actuary statements. Following this meeting, those knowledge statements will be finalized and formally submitted to HATIF in a final version. During LATIF, the Academy President Daryl Knapp, President-elect Tricia Matson, and Life Practice Council PBR Implementation Subcommittee Chairperson Linda Lankowski presented the qualified actuary knowledge statements and shared that the illustration actuary knowledge statements would be shared with the task force before the end of the year. LATIF will expose revisions to the appointed actuary knowledge statements and the drafted qualified actuary knowledge statements for a 45-day period. Following this discussion, the final version of the drafts will be submitted to LATIF by the Academy. In HATIF, there was an opportunity to discuss the public comments received by the task force on the health-appointed actuary knowledge statements. The Academy will be drafting a formal comment letter responding to the public comments. The final version of the drafted health knowledge statements will then be submitted by the end of the year. And the NAIC is never complete without an Academy cross-practice dinner. More than 60 volunteers, regulators, NAIC staff, and other key external stakeholders joined us for the dinner and casual conversation. The Academy was also represented at other events during the national meeting, including the SOA's reception, an InsurTech breakfast with the Louisiana Insurance Commissioner, Tim Temple, the ACLI reception, and AHIP's reception. Finally, on the last day of the meeting was the annual election of NAIC officers. For 2025, North Dakota's Commissioner John Gottfried will serve as president, with Virginia's Commissioner Scott White as president-elect, Rhode Island's Director Elizabeth Dwyer as vice president, and Utah's Commissioner John Pike as secretary-treasurer. With that, I'll pass it back over to Ted, who will get us started on the practice area updates. Ted?
Thank you, Matthew. So next, let me turn to Amanda for her recap of what went on in Denver from the life perspective. Amanda?
Thank you, Ted. As you mentioned, my name is Amanda Berry-Moylanen, and I'm the Life Policy Analyst for the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm going to briefly discuss the activities of the Life Practice Council at the NAIC's national meeting. The LPC is extremely responsive to the Life Actuarial Task Force, which sits under the NAIC's A committee. In addition to LATIF, Academy staff and members of the LPC interacted with the GO subgroup, which reports to A and E committee, and Oliver Wyman on the Generator of Economic Scenarios project, and the VM22 subgroup, and the Experience Reporting subgroup. We also work with the Interstate Insurance Product Regulation Commission on index-linked variable annuity products. In terms of main issue priorities that were covered in Denver, I'll start with the asset adequacy testing for reinsurance issue. The LPC continues to support LATIF in their efforts to draft an actuarial guideline targeted at some concerns that regulators have identified with some offshore reinsurance transactions. And that work is ongoing. And we anticipate more report outs in Indianapolis. In terms of the VM22 field test, our annuity reserve and capital subcommittee has been very engaged in supporting LATIF's implementation of PBR and VM22. ARCS is currently working with the NAIC and EY to aggregate the results of the field test. They're also working on developing a VM22 practice note for practicing actuaries. In terms of the GOES project, or the generator of economic scenarios, we have a subcommittee specifically targeted at responding to updates on the GOES project, and they've spent the last few years working on stylized facts and acceptance criteria at the regulator's request, and have developed multiple education sessions on the economic scenario generator for the Life Actuarial Task Force. In terms of interest maintenance reserves, our Life Valuation Committee and Variable Annuity and Reserve Capital Subcommittee have been very engaged with LATIF on this issue. No substantive updates coming out of Denver, but definitely an issue to be aware of. And then in addition, on the risk-based capital front, our C1 subcommittee is engaged in a long-term research project to determine comparable attributes for CLOs, or collateralized loan obligations. This is at the request of the risk-based capital investment risk and evaluation working group. And then in addition, our life investment and capital adequacy committee continues to work with the life risk-based capital working group on covariance for C factors for risk-based capital. In terms of key takeaways, our continued support on the VM22 field test and the results, working on offshore reinsurance, and our continued support for the GOES project and model office testing, as well as our work on the discrimination in life insurance underwriting issue that's being addressed in several states. That's all I have for life, and I will hand it off to Rob Fisher, the property and casualty analyst.
Thanks, Amanda. Here's a quick rundown of the Casualty Practice Council's activities at the NAIC National Meeting in Denver. So in addition to the ASB, ABCD, and COQ professionalism updates that Matthew Sonduck mentioned, I provided an update to the Casualty Actuarial and Statistical Task Force, CASTIF, on CPC recent publications, expected papers, webinars, and seminars occurring in the rest of 2024. Prior to that CASTF meeting, Academy staff held a brief meeting with NAIC staff on the logistics and timing of their educational assessment on the CAS and SOA exam syllabi. This exercise last took place in 2019, so it's fresh for a new review. The NAIC is requiring the 3 actuarial organizations to provide 12 volunteers each to review the syllabi and compare them against the P&C knowledge statements by end of January, to provide the regulators enough time to review and recommend any changes before the spring. And then the following day, Senior Casualty Fellow Rich Gibson presented an overview of the recently published P&C Committee on Equity and Fairness's issue brief titled Insurance Fraud Impacts on Premiums, Claim Costs, and the Public, to the public meeting of the Anti-Fraud Task Force. In addition to that, in more equity and fairness issues, the Special Committee on Race and Insurance's P&C workstream met and heard a presentation from the Washington, D.C. DISB on their final report titled Market Conduct Examination Evaluating Unintentional Bias in Private Passenger Auto Insurance. The P&C Committee on Equity and Fairness provided feedback to the DISB, both in the public comments and in a meeting with the regulators, and continue to engage on that report as they went through the publication process. And they are staying plugged in with the department as they work through the 6 steps that they identified to continue researching on in the findings of that report. So in the key takeaways for the CPC from NAIC last month, they include, staying engaged on CASTF's educational assessment as it progresses, and sending them the 12 volunteers that have graciously volunteered their time, staying in touch and helping out the DISB as they move forward with their plans on unintentional bias in auto insurance in 2025. We also learned during the catastrophe insurance working groups meeting that there will be action on the NFIP front in Congress in the new year. So our Extreme Events Committee is already hard at work to get ahead of any hearings or bills that may be introduced in the new Congress. And then, as always, there's continued interest from the committee from the cybersecurity working group on our committee's cyber risk toolkit, as they continue to learn more about cyber insurance, and we continue to update old papers and release new ones to keep that working group informed. With that, I'll pass it on to Matthew Williams to speak to the Health Practice Council.
Thank you, Rob. I'm Matthew Williams. I'm the Senior Health Policy Analyst here at the Academy, and just want to give you some quick updates from our Health Practice Council and the work that we did at the NAIC's national meeting in Denver. We actually presented to the Health Actuarial Task Force, HATF, on some of the recent things that the Health Practice Council has been doing, some of our upcoming events, webinars, talked about some of the projects that we've worked on over the past few months. So we presented to them on that. In regards to priority issues, my colleague Matthew Sondak already mentioned this, but there was a discussion during HATF about the draft health knowledge statements for health appointed actuaries, and are working on responding to those and submitting it to the NAIC by the end of the year. That was a big takeaway from that meeting. Also, in regards to long-term care, we had some work come out of the long-term care, both the working group, the long-term care actuarial working group and task force. They're working on the development of a single long-term care insurance multi-state review framework. It's work that's been going on for a few years, but the group has settled on a one method of rate review and is working on updating the framework. So that was a key takeaway from that. Just kind of noting that on our key takeaways, there's continued interest in the Academy's long-term care work. We're working on a few different issue briefs, particularly on the state of long-term care, where things are at post-COVID-19 in regards to long-term care, and we will be publishing those in early 2025. We'll also be having a webinar in February of 2025, so keep a lookout for that and hope you're able to join us. So definitely some interest in the Academy's work on that. I noted just a second ago the NAIC is working on the MSA review framework. So they've actually exposed that framework for public comment. They have a redline version, and those comments are going to be due on December 13th, so upcoming pretty soon here. Another key takeaway from the meeting in general, from this one was actually from the Senior Issues Task Force. CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, is working with the NAIC on producing a frequently asked questions, or FAQ, document on its website to provide centralized information on enrollment changes, significant provider network changes, and is working on just overall communication and responsiveness and feedback from participants, and is setting up a single point of contact mailbox for the NAIC and state regulators to send any issues or questions they have. So this is in regards to particularly the Medicare Advantage, the Medigap, and the special enrollment period issue that had come up with some of the communication. So looking to CMS's work with the NAIC to streamline that, provide a feedback loop mechanism to try to resolve any issues. The other thing, just wanted to note also that the NAIC's Special Committee on Race and Insurance, also known as SCORI, will soon be disbanded, and the majority of the DE&I work, diversity, equity, inclusion work for the NAIC will be assumed by the letter committees. And so for health, that would be the B committee. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Will with our Risk and Financial Management Practice Council.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm Will Bedke. I'm the Risk Management and Financial Reporting Policy Analyst with the Academy. And here you can see a quick rundown of REMFRIC updates from NAIC. So REMFRIC committees routinely interact with a variety of NAIC committees and task forces outlined at the top of the screen, which routinely, interact with various priorities. Some of the key ideas and key things we are following at this fall's meeting were AI and the use of third-party data. And so a few of the updates that came from the meeting were on various surveys NAIC is conducting, one of which is the Health AI Machine Learning Survey, which is currently being administered and is scheduled to have a written report about by March 17th. A few of the differences from the previous Health, Auto, Health, Home, and Life surveys include a focus on AI and pre-identified product lines and operational functions of health insurers, questions specifically addressing areas of data usage, arrangements with third parties and their usage of third-party data, as well as coordination of governance with existing health provider guidance standards. They also provided an update on the auto survey, which main themes includes any changes of their use of AI, the value of the guidance included in the AI model bulletin, which NAIC previously produced, as well as the government or development and issues of establishing an effective governance program. So these surveys are particularly relevant to the Data Science and Analytics Committee, as well as the AI Subcommittee, as they're planning on a webinar centering around these two issues and 3 surveys, specifically the auto, home, and life, in early 2025. Moving on to some international monitoring updates. So there's a presentation from IAIS and the conclusion of their comparability assessment and the aggregation method to the ICSC Insurance Capital Standard. So that is scheduled to be adopted at the time of the recording on December 4th and 5th. They're having their annual meeting in South Africa. So there will be an update from that, but that is the current plan. IAIS also provided an update of the implementation process, which will work closely with the NAIC on their approach and integrating those two with the aggregation method and implementing it into the US standards. IAIS also just released their 2024 GMAR report on December 3rd. And finally moving on to the accounting and practices and procedures updates. So they adopted a revision to the SSAP number 128 derivatives, hedging and variable annuity guarantees. So they adopted a revision to the definition of the clearly defined hedging strategy to reflect the revised guidance pursuant to the VM01 model. And they also expose a number of different statutory accounting principles and concepts. And they all have an exposure period ending at the end of January 31st, 2025 is when they are scheduled to be closed. And they also touched on the continuing work on climate risk, specifically with the exposure papers from the IAIS. And they also have a few reinsurance-related exposures with a few deadlines in December, being the 9th and the 16th. Key takeaways. So I mentioned the scheduled webinar on the machine learning and AI NAIC surveys. There's also interest in the recently published white paper on hedge accounting and how insurance companies manage risk, which related to a few of the initiatives the accounting committees are working on, as well as just continued interest in the growing changes in the reinsurance industry, as well as AI governance and the use of third-party data. With that covers the REMFRIC fall meeting, and I'll pass it along to Steve Jackson for research.
Thank you, Will. I'm Steve Jackson, Director of Research at the Academy, and during the recent meeting in Denver, I was honored to represent the Academy and the many strands of research currently underway at the Academy, and that contemplated for the near future. This includes work done by research staff, but also includes work being done by volunteers on research projects and by consultants hired by the Academy. I also try to include work which is being done at the Academy, which is not technically research, but which is of interest to those who are interested in the research. So it's related to it usually. My representation includes presentation of our ongoing work, meeting with regulators and NAIC staff, meeting with Academy members, and then meeting with other stakeholders to discuss both our current research efforts and potential future efforts. To be more specific, I joined with Chris Conrad, chair of the Academy's Annuity Reserves and Capital Subcommittee, and with Angela McShane and Sean Abbott from Ernst & Young to discuss with the Life Actuarial Task Force the VM22 field test, as mentioned already by Amanda. We updated them on the status of our effort to aggregate the field test results and to be able to make them available for public discussion. Ernst & Young presented in public for the first time results from their model office analysis of the proposed VM22, and collectively we responded to questions from LATIF members both during and after the presentation. I also presented our plan for research on the expenses associated with title insurance to the Title Insurance Task Force, fielding several questions and suggestions in response. This is our second presentation to the task force of our plans for this research, research which resulted in large part from a request to the Academy from the leadership of the task force, a request to begin providing independent, objective research on title insurance. In our discussions with NAIC staff and regulators, we were both discussing our current work and learning and exploring areas of future potential interest, whether on technology, international issues, or additional field tests for the Life Actuarial Task Force. With members, we were discussing both ongoing projects and ones where research might assist volunteers in developing information that would be useful for their production of issue briefs or other products. And finally, with other stakeholders, we were discussing primarily possible future issues for research and the potential for collaboration. One set of discussions throughout the meetings involved the industry university cooperative research centers, which are currently being established by the National Science Foundation, one set on climate change and another on catastrophic cyber risk and terrorism. And those are being set up with the active participation of the Academy. And we had discussions with several, both academic and industry people interested in participating in those centers. Now let me send it back to Ted to lead us into the next section of our webinar.
Thanks so much for that update, Steve. So, as we just heard, the Academy had a lot of engagement with regulators and other key stakeholders in the Mile High City. But what can we expect from the NAIC in the coming months leading up to the March meeting in Indianapolis? Well, to learn more, let's get started by again touching base with our analysts and Steve Jackson, our research director. We'll start with Rob, who will discuss casually. Rob?
Thanks, Ted. Just as mentioned previously, we're staying coordinated with CASIV's educational assessment as it progresses. There will be more to come after our piece ends in January, likely, so they're staying tuned on that. And there are also a couple opportunities for presentations on bias from the Committee on Equity and Fairness and our Cyber Risk Committee, which, as they have new work products that'll be published in the early spring.
Sorry about that. The pesky mute button. Let me just change to Matthew Williams and Health on that next to give us an update.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the NAIC's long-term care insurance task force has exposed a redline version of their long-term care insurance MSA framework with comments due on December 13th. So we're actually working on that through our long-term care committee on providing and developing comments for that. And then with potential discussion of the comments on the next call, which I believe is on December 18th. So coming up here in a few weeks. The other thing is just continuing to finalize and submit the HADITH, Health Appointed Actuary Knowledge Statements, using the comments that we received during the NAIC's fall meeting, national meeting in Denver.
Great, thank you, Matthew Williams. I guess turning now over to Amanda and Life.
Thank you, Ted. So, in response to requests from Life Risk-Based Capital, the LPC has formed a subcommittee to focus on the C3 factors for risk-based capital. So they're undertaking their work on that now. They just identified a chair and they're starting to get going. So hopefully there will be some substantive update in Indianapolis from that new subcommittee. In addition to the work on the C3 factors, we anticipate a substantive presentation to RBC IRE on the CLO Comparable Attributes Research Project. So look out for that. And then, as I previously mentioned, continued work with LATIF on the offshore reinsurance issue, as well as the Generator of Economic Scenarios project. And then, as Matthew Williams mentioned earlier, the SCORI work streams are being escalated up to their letter committees. So previously, the LPC had been engaging with the SCORI Life work stream on life insurance underwriting. And now we will continue to monitor that as it is escalated to what will be a committee for us. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Amanda. And now William Remfrick.
Thank you, Ted. So Remfrick committees are going to continue to monitor the ever-changing, AI world. And the Big Data and AI Working Group at NAIC discussed their 2025 charges, which included a discussion on AI system evaluations and shifting that discussion to consumer outcomes throughout the year, which may end up leading to a gap analysis of how well current regulatory framework holds up against potential harms from the use of AI, as well as whether additional regulatory filings and disclosures to consumers or regulators are needed, and whether those will bring harm or should be required or prohibited. So continuing to monitor those developments and future climate change and climate risk efforts, including the Climate Resilience Strategy report, which was recently published, as well as just keeping in touch with the various committees Remfrick has a continued relationship with, and continuing to file exposures or submit comments to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And then just finally, last but certainly not least, Steve Jackson and research.
Thanks much, Ted. Indianapolis will be busy for the research team. We're committed to 2 presentations, repeating or extending presentations we did this past time. So we'll be before the Life Actuarial Task Force again with more results from the VM22, both the aggregation of the field test and additional model office results. And again, we'll be joined by chair of the Annuity Reserve and Capital Subcommittee, and also Ernst & Young. We'll also be presenting to the Title Insurance Task Force again, this time with at least first results from the project. And we're in discussion with staff and regulators about two additional presentations. One of the revised version of the Actuaries Climate Index, which should be going live around the time of the meeting. But we'll be presenting on that revised index almost certainly. And then we're also discussing with staff and regulators reporting on our work on modeling cyber risk, where we will have a couple pieces out and ongoing work. That's it for research that we know of at the moment. Back to you, Ted.
Thank you, Steve and analysts, for all your updates. We hope you have enjoyed this post-NAIC webinar. If you have any questions on the activities we highlighted or want to know more about the Academy's engagement with the NAIC, please reach out to any of the staff on this webinar. We can be found on the website, www.actuary.org, and our contact information is included in the attached slide deck. You can also always reach the team by emailing publicpolicy@actuary.org. But before we go, there are several Academy products and events we want to let you know about as we near the end of 2024. First, check out the public policy page on the Academy's website. You'll find out more information on the issues and priorities of the Academy, links to future webinars in December and early next year, including several recent ones that can still be viewed, and how to volunteer yourself. Next, the Life and Health Valuation Law Manual highlights key valuation developments and specific state guidance, as well as current NAIC model laws and regulations that affect reserve calculations. You can view the QR code on this slide to order your electronic copy. Finally, the PC Loss Revenue Law Manual details SAO requirements and the laws and regulations establishing those requirements, as well as annual statement instructions for the SAO for property casualty, title loss, and loss expense reserves. Again, use the QR code on this slide to reserve a copy. And mark your 2025 calendars for the Investment Symposium, May 22nd, 23rd in New York City, the Future of Retirement Symposium next summer in DC, the Health Equity and Behavioral Health Symposium in the fall in DC, and the annual PNC Opinion Seminar, which will be held in December of 2025 in Salt Lake City. We also encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn and head over to www.contingencies.org to peruse the Academy's soon-to-be rebranded Policy Issues Clearinghouse, the Actuarially Sound blog, and the Actuary Voices podcast. We hope you will join us again early next year following the NAIC Spring National Meeting, which is scheduled for March 23rd through the 27th in Indianapolis. And don't be shy. Tell your colleagues and coworkers about this webinar so they can get all in on the Academy and what the NAIC are doing together in the insurance space. Until then, be well.